Welcome to the California State Archives Preservation Lab. My name is Juan Ramos. I'm a document preservation technician, and I'm going on my 23rd year here at the California State Archives. I am responsible for the long-term physical care of the documents we have in our facility. And 90% of them are paper-based documents and books, bound volumes. In 2007, we initiated our very first preservation workshop, which was open to the public. It was an all-day, hands-on, free workshop that included the basics of preservation and repair on paper-based documents. Now, that was one of our most successful outreach programs, but as we all know, in 2020, that stopped. But that gave us time to reflect on how can we spread the workshop to a more wider audience. And thus, welcome to our first virtual preservation workshop. In this segment, I'm going to show you how to safely flatten a document. And it's actually more simple than you think it will be. Here are the materials that you will need. First, a container. And we ordered this from a lab, but this can be a baking dish. It can be a packing crate. Nothing made of wood, though. It should either be glass or preferably plastic. And the first thing you do is take blotter paper. And if you don't have blotter paper, just use a towel. Wet the towel and then wring it dry. So I'm going to set the blotter paper here. And then I'm going to wet it. And make sure in all the segments that I show you here, whenever you use water, it has to be distilled water or ionized water. Don't ever use tap water in anything I show you here. Now, you don't want the water sitting in the tray, so I'm going to pour off the excess. Because you just want the source of the moisture moist and not soaking wet. Then you get what I call an egg crate, and you can buy this at a hardware store. It's used to cover fluorescent lights. And that would go right on top of the blotter paper. And this is product name Remay or Interleaving. You can buy it at a fabric store. And what this does is it protects the document from any moisture. And also, if a document is wet, you can pick it up using this instead of handling the actual document. So it kind of cradles the document. So you set that there. And then you've got your document. Now, a lot of these documents that we have even here in the archives are very tightly rolled. And this is an actual document from the archives, but I was given permission to use it. And you can see how tightly rolled it is. And I could leave it in here in the chamber without just rolled, and it eventually would relax, but I kind of want to speed up the process. So I'm going to use glass. And you could use maybe pieces of plexi, but I'm going to put it on each corner to just unroll it. And then, very important, you want to be able to see the progress of your document. So always have a cover. This is plexiglass. And you place it over because you always want to check on your document. Now, one thing I forgot to mention here is to always pre-test your document, make sure the ink doesn't run. And a good way to do that is just dip a Q-tip in distilled water, touch an area where there's ink, and if it runs, then it's probably not a good document to deflatten in this way. Now, I'm going to let that sit for at least 6 hours, and then I'll show you the final result. Okay, now we're ready to see the finished product of the flattening process. So taking the cover off the humidification chamber, removing the glass, and as you can see, the paper is nice and relaxed, no longer curling anymore. And so I'm going to lift it up. I mean, I can't pick this up on its own, but I just want to show you another benefit of the remake. So I'm going to place the remake on blotter paper. Again, it's that sandwich we were talking about for mending tears and workspace. Press that down just a bit. And then create the rest of the sandwich. Remake on top. And blotter paper. And then I'm just going to place weights on the top. And then just let that dry, because if you had touched the paper, you could feel how it was actually damp because it absorbed a lot of the moisture. But you let this dry for about an hour, and it'll be dry and nice and flat. This segment is on surface cleaning of paper-based documents. Now, my 23 years here at the archives, paper, documents, bound volumes get really, really dirty because you're talking about the slow accumulation of dust and pollution over centuries. And a lot of times we receive records from retired legislators who have kept their records in a garage or someplace where there's no environmental controls. So we get a lot of dusty, dirty items, and they have to be cleaned. And they have to be preferably cleaned before they're flattened, before they're mended for tears, because if you try to mend a dirty document, you're going to get a very dirty mend. So it has to be cleaned beforehand. Now there's a couple of methods here I'm going to show you. I'm going to start with a book first because books do get dirty, but the advantage with books is they're closed. So it's usually just the outside of the book that gets dirty. And the safest way to clean a book is just using a drafter's brush, a very soft bristle brush. A couple of samples here. And you want to brush out from the spine outward on the outside and just clean the outside of those pages. Now, if you know a book is really dirty on the inside, in what we call the gutter, you can go to the gutter and do the same thing. So that's fairly simple with a book. Now, this particular case, this book is made out of textile, and a lot of times the dust accumulates on the cover. Now, don't do this with leather because you never want to use an eraser on leather. But a textile can be erased and the dirt can be cleaned off. You can kind of see a difference because you see this white eraser is turning dark when I do erase it. And that's all the dirt that's being accumulated by the eraser. Now when we talk about surface cleaning, we are talking primarily about erasers. And there are different types of erasers. I'll show you three actually. We have a gum eraser, and we have a white eraser, and I'll talk about that later. And then we have dry sponges, which are also erasers, and they each have their particular use. My preference is a white eraser. These are used by artists, and I prefer them because they're safer for documents of historical significance. So this is my preference. Now, I have two samples here, and one is tissue paper. And keep in mind that paper comes in all sorts of thicknesses and textures. So I have basically a stronger paper here and what would be considered a thin paper, almost tissue paper. And you generally like to start from the middle and just push out. And what I've done here, this is kind of simulated dirt. It's mostly pencil because it's kind of hard, as much as I talk about authentic dirt, it's hard to find samples for, for instruction. So I just covered these in pencil dust basically. But you can see here the same thing is happening. The granules are turning dark because they're absorbing the dirt on the document. And same thing here. Now again, it's a matter of preference on the type of eraser, but as you can see here, the gum eraser does the same thing, but the gum eraser tends to be a little rough, and if you're not careful, you can actually tear the document. That's why I prefer the white, because it's more flexible. Now, if you have a large document, say a huge map, which we do have, it's going to take you forever to just do this movement for a whole large document. So the easiest way to do that is to use the erasers in granular form. And that just allows you, makes it easier to cover a larger space. Now all this really is, all these granules are, is just these white erasers ground up. And it is rather expensive to buy these, but you can also make your own. Just get a spice grater and grate your own. Now again, let's just assume that this whole thing is a document. You just pour the granules on, use your hands, rotating, and again you can see that it's absorbing the dirt, it's changing color. And same thing here. And again, this is just for larger documents, and I've had more large documents to work on than I care to remember. But this does speed up the process quite a bit. Okay. Now, I'm going to brush this off. If you have a document that's really thin, like tissue paper, and this comes pretty close, or a document that has pencil marks, because you don't want to erase pencil marks, even little notes, even scribbles. That's part of the history of the document, so you don't want to erase them. But sometimes you get a document that's written in pencil that is just really, really dirty. So in this case, I use a dry sponge. And the dry sponge, you can blot, or you can just rub really lightly to where you're erasing the dirt and not the pencil. So that's one way to treat a very delicate document. It takes a little longer, obviously, but you can see the dirt, it's absorbed already. Now, if it's really, really fragile, one thing you can do, and I have done this as well, if it's just fragile and you feel it's going to tear just by touching it, just sprinkle on the granules, take your brush, and just work it through. And then again, keep an eye out for if there are pencil markings, make sure that you don't decrease the visibility of those pencil markings, because again, those are part of the history. So that's a very gentle way of cleaning. Now we do have, you can also get document cleaning powder, which is gummed eraser ground up. And again, it pretty much works the same way. And it's really a matter of preference. Again, my preference is the white erasers and their granules. But if it's a strong document with no pencil markings, strong ink, then this works just as well. And again, you see the process, it's absorbing the dirt. Okay. Now the thing to remember here when you're cleaning a document and you've completed the cleaning is to make sure you brush off all the residue. And sometimes the brush isn't enough, so we have a large supply of actual cloth diapers, and we use them a lot in the lab. Most people think I'm joking, but I'm really not. But one way to make sure that the granules are all off, any residue, is just to use the diaper. Now the diaper is also a great way to clean old rolled up photographs, especially the long ones that have like classes. I had one a couple of years ago that I rolled out, and it looked clean in my eyes, but then I took a diaper and I started cleaning it, and the diaper just absorbed all this filth. And I looked at the photo and, oh my gosh, it was really getting clear. So this is the best way to clean old photos. So that pretty much sums it up on surface cleaning. We're going to talk about paste making here. And when I talk about paste making, it's basically the adhesive that we use to mend tears. And it's wheat paste, purified wheat paste. And the reason we use wheat paste is because it's reversible, but it's still a pretty powerful adhesive. So we have the choice of either wheat paste or rice paste, but again, my preference is wheat paste. So that'll be one of our ingredients. And again, whenever we're going to use water, always make sure it's distilled water or ionized water, which we have here from the tap. You'll need a beaker to mix in, or if you don't have a beaker, just use a Pyrex baking cup. And pretty much the equivalent of a butter knife, and you'll use that for mixing and stirring and scraping, that sort of thing. And a wooden spoon and a netting of some sort that you can press the paste through to get rid of the lumps. This is actually the top of a steamer from a Japanese steamer. It's the top of it, and I like the grate on it, and I'll show you later on how I use that. Measuring spoon, of course, and let's see, and then also a petri dish, or just a smaller covered container. So now, before the invention of microwaves, this was cooked in a pot over a stove, and you can still do that, but it takes about almost a half hour just constant stirring. Or a microwave takes about 10 minutes at the most. So start off with the wheat starch. And it's basically 1 part wheat starch to 5 parts of water. So I'm going to use, doesn't have to be a level tablespoon, but a tablespoon of the wheat starch. And the equivalent of 5 tablespoons of water. Okay. Now you want to make sure that the powder is hydrated in the water. I mean, really hydrated. So I stir for 30 to 60 seconds, but really stir it and make sure it's hydrated. And when you've done that, you let it sit until it usually takes about 10 to 20 minutes. You let it sit until you see the sediment come to the bottom. And you rehydrate Now, if you don't do that, if you let the sediment sit there and you put it in the microwave, you're going to end up with basically a wheat starch cookie. So you got to make sure you rehydrate before you start the cooking process in the microwave. Again, I'm going to do that for about 30 to 60 seconds. Okay. And you place it in the microwave initially for about 20 seconds. You can see that it's already thickened. I mean, really thickened. So you give it a really good stir. Scrape any glue that sticks to the side, and make sure you scrape all the any paste on the bottom, but just get it really stirred well. Okay. Now, when you put this back in the microwave, and incidentally, it preferably a microwave that rotates, because I've never actually done this in a microwave that doesn't rotate. So keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to put it in now for about 10 to 15 seconds. Now, if you're using a beaker and you look inside the microwave while it's cooking, you'll see that the paste will start to rise. And if you don't stop it, it'll bubble over the edge, and you don't want that to happen. So you want to catch it before it goes over the edge. And again, the same thing. You just stir it, scrape any from the sides. And you're going to repeat this process about 4 to 5 times. Okay. Okay, this looks like it's ready to go to the next stage. Now, can you see inside? Once it starts to get glassy, and when you scrape around the edges, it kind of releases from the side. That's when you know that the cooking process is done. So that is pretty much ready for the next stage. However, it does need to cool for about 5 minutes. So I'm going to cool it down even more, and I'm going to work it out with my hands from this container and put it to another container and fill that with cold distilled or deionized water and let that sit for about 2 minutes. Now, once it's cooled with water, I'm going to remove this and place it on this grid, which is again is the top of a steamer. And this process is to remove all the lumps from the paste. So I'm going to use, I prefer a round wooden spoon. It should be wooden, but I just prefer the round wooden spoon, and I'm just going to press it in until it's all pressed out and sticks to the other side. It shouldn't fall off. It should just stick to the netting on the opposite side. This can take about 10 minutes sometimes. Now you can see that it's stuck to the other side. So I'm going to take it through one more pass to bring it back up to the same side I started on. Okay, and that's done and ready to go into a container. Now that's been pressed through twice, it's just at that right consistency, no lumps. So you want to get this into a container, and preferably a container that has a lid, because this will be kept in the refrigerator. Keep in mind that this is condensed. You only want a small portion for different projects. So what you're going to do is preferably, Petri dish is perfect, or just a small container that has a lid on it. And I always try to make sure that it's a container with kind of a wide base, because these can tip over very easily when you're working. So you just take a small portion of the condensed paste. I'll just put a little bit more there. And then you're going to mix it with just a little bit of water. And just mix it around. You can use a brush or an implement like this butter knife, but you just want it a bit thinner than the concentrated form. So this is the consistency you want. I can equate it to just very thick lotion. And if you don't use this for one project, you can put it back in the fridge for the next day. So put a lid on that, and we are ready to mend. Before I start the session on mending paper tears, I want to make sure that you do not tape an important document. Taping is very difficult to remove. It's a whole nother session, and even experienced conservators have problems removing tape, because there's always a danger of removing the surface layer, which means information. And you can see here, if you leave the tape on long enough, it almost seems to dissolve the paper. Thankfully, the signature is still here, but there's nothing I can do to even try to remove this, because if I do, the signature will come off, this handwritten signature here, and that's altering the history, and I can't do that. So, when we mend tears, what we use for glue is a paste that I just made, the wheat paste. And what we use as tape, if you want to call it that, is mending paper that is handmade in Japan. And there's all sorts of tones and thicknesses and textures. And you just pick the ones that are best for your needs. Now this is expensive paper. A 24 by 30 sheet goes from about $40 to $50, so it gets really expensive. So I save smaller pieces to use for smaller jobs. But because of the cost, I've narrowed it down for our purposes here in the California State Archives to 2 mending papers. This is Hosokawa Oban. It is really strong paper, very strong. So I use it for repairing books, for repairing maps, things where the paper is very strong and thick. This is Kizukishi, which is almost like tissue paper. And I use that for, again, thinner paper or very fragile paper. And as you'll see, you have to handle this in completely different ways. So again, the materials here are the paste. You want a little beaker of water. These glass plates, I'll show you that they're an option. I used to use them a lot. I don't use them as much anymore, but I still want to show them to you as an option. Now, this you saw in these materials, you saw in the flattening segment. This again is blotting paper, just cut to different shape. And this is remay, interleaving, cut into smaller shapes. And you'll see how I use that. You want a pair of scissors, a flathead brush that's thicker, and a pointed brush, a bone folder, and a spatula. You can use that. I don't use it as much, but I'll show you how you can use it. So I'm going to start with the thinner paper. Now this is almost like tissue paper. And before I start that, I'm also going to put on my glasses because I need my glasses when I'm in tears. Okay, now, again, make sure that the text and the information is lined up. One way you can keep it in place is to take the glass plates after you've lined it up, and that'll hold the paper in place. And the tear is right there. So I make sure it's lined up. The glass plates are holding it in place. Okay, now, when you're working with either any mending paper, never cut it. You always want to tear it to size. And one thing that, even though they're in different tones and colors and textures, what they do have in common is they're all very fibrous. You can see here the fibers sticking out at the ends on both these samples. And those fibers are important because they're like fingers grasping onto the paper, and they help it to stay on the paper once you've adhered it. But again, never cut it because you'll notice the cut when you do, whereas when you tear it, it blends in. Now this is fairly easy to tear, and I always like to tear it by hand, and I never have any problem with the fibers showing. So you cut it just a little bit longer than the tear, but actually, let's see, twice as long as a tear, and I'll show you why. Okay. Now the thing with Kizukishi is because it's so thin, you can wet it directly, but then it becomes almost like wet toilet paper at that point, so it's really hard to work with. So the easiest way to lay it onto the paper is to get a little bit of the wheat paste on your brush and brush it on directly onto the document. Then lay your mend on there, your paper on there. Take the brush and lay it down. And if there's excess, it can either be trimmed off or folded over when you dry it. Then once it's in place, you take a small piece of the remay, press that on there, and you can also take your bone folder and press it down even more. By the way, this is a Teflon bone folder, which I really like. It's a little more expensive, but it's a lot more gentle on paper. So press that down, then take your blotter paper, and that's going to absorb all the moisture. Now, there's two ways to flatten it while it's drying. You can use a glass plate and then put a weight on it. And yeah, that works really well. But I prefer, over time, I just preferred not to use the glass. I'm not saying it's not a good option, because it is, but my preference is just to use a soft weight, because a soft weight tends to take on the shape of the paper. It's a little more gentle, and so I'm going to leave that on there. Leave that on there for about 10 minutes to dry, and then I'll come back and check on it. Now this is, again, the stronger paper. I'm going to use this end here. Now this, again, I'm going to use the Hosokawa Oban, which is, again, the stronger paper. Do the same thing here, and I'm not going to worry about the glass edges because there's really no texture. I can line it up pretty well without that. But I'm going to, again, tear a strip. Now, some conservators like to create a strip by wetting one side. And that, again, that's just a personal preference. But it's always good to try to show you the options here. So you just take a brush with distilled water and moisten it on one side and then tear. And you can see it actually brings out more fibers at the end. But again, it's personal preference, and neither is wrong. I think the outcome is still the same. Okay. Let's see, then I'm going to extend it out about halfway. And I'll show you why I'm extending it out. There's a reason for that. Okay, now, because this is Hosokawa Oban and it's stronger, you can lay it on, this is non-acidic cardboard, and we have a lot of scraps in it because we make custom-made containers out of it. But if you don't have that, I'd say blotter paper will work just as well. I just prefer this cardboard. And lay it in place, and then put the paste directly on the paper. And because it is stronger, you can handle it even when it's wet a lot easier than you can with the Kizukishi. Okay. So some people like to use tweezers. I just prefer to handle it because so much of this job is tactile. And if there's excess, it can either be trimmed off or folded over when you dry it. Take your rime, lay it down, and press it down with your bone folder. I prefer laying the rime on there first because there is always a chance if you go directly on the paper you can tear it, but the rime protects it from that. So you can actually flatten it without fear of tearing the paper. So lay that on there with the blotter paper. And keep in mind that this is the same surface I'm working on. This is actually blotter paper and rime. So this is a surface you always want to work on when you're mending because you can lay it on there and you have the same sandwich on both sides when it's drying. And I think on this one I'll just use the glass because again it's an option. And press that on there. Now a lot of times you have to mend paper pages, and that can get a little tricky. There's the tear, and again remember when you're going to repair a page in a book, you've got to have that surface for the page under the page, so you have that sandwich. So that would be blotter paper and then rime, and make sure it's directly under that tear. And I'm going to use the glass here, just kind of hold the pages in place. And on this, I think, I'm going to use a Kizukishi because I don't want to cover, you can read text through the thicker Hosokawa Oban, but it's a lot, when it's something this important, I want to make sure that the text can be read easily. So again, I'm going to cut a mend that's twice the size of the tear, or cut a mend paper twice the size of the tear. And again, this is Kizukishi. So now you notice here there's a scarf, and by a scarf is when you tear it and you bring it back up, you'll see a white part of the paper where the top has been torn off. And you want to make sure that's always at the bottom, and that helps you line it up. And you can even touch it a bit with paste, and that gets it in place. But because it's Kizukishi, I'm going to wet the page instead of the paper. Lay that mend down. And again, take your remay and press it down. Then your blotter paper. And again, keep in mind you have that sandwich, because under the page is the same sandwich. So it'd be the remay, the blotter paper. And then to flatten it, just close the book and place a weight on it. Now these are two examples of mended documents. This map here on the left, I've made the mends a little more obvious, and that's just for training purposes and also tours. And this one is a little more subtle. It's almost hard to see the mends, but to help you understand what I'm talking about, there's the mends right there. And again, I did make these thicker for the benefit of the viewer. This was torn up into about 15 pieces and then put back together. But I wanted to emphasize how difficult it can be to piece a map together, because you have all this text. Again, rivers, roads, railroad lines, longitude, latitude, all those things have to intersect correctly for the researcher. Now this one is a bit more subtle, and these are both mended from the back, which is hard to do, but it can be done pretty effectively. But in this case, the mending paper matched the original so well that it just kind of blends in under normal light. Now, one reason I emphasize everything that I've showed you here on repairing documents is that if you don't repair the documents, this is what eventually happens. This is what remains of the California census schedule of 1852. This was, the census apparently the records were stored at the basement of the Capitol when the flood hit, and so the documents were wet, and that was bad enough. Then mold set in, and the documents were probably more than likely acidic anyway, but without any preservation intervention, this eventually is what you have left as something very important historically.